I've started 10 small businesses here in the state, and so I understand what it's like to hire people and pay paychecks and keep things running through recessions. And I've been involved in public life for 20 years here in the state. I've served in the state senate, as you folks know, in the 1990s. And since then I've remained very active politically. You folks, and appreciate you folks' editorial support on the anti-casino cause that I chaired for 10 solid years, and managed to defeat basically a Las Vegas enterprise that wanted to have a casino in Salem 10 years running, despite being outspent at 10, 100, 1,000 to 1 some years, much to everyone's amazement, by bringing people together in that coalition that no one ever imagined could be that broad. We had the broadest coalition in the state, and we were able to outthink them. We were usually a year or two ahead of where they would be, and we were there in advance. And I'd like to bring those talents to Washington. We've got some serious problems in the country, and it means something, because I'm the only Republican candidate that actually lives in the state, and it does mean something if you live in the state. I get roots here, and my family and myself, 2 generations, have property in Maine. I go up there very frequently, at least once a month. But I'm not competent to represent Maine. I don't have roots there, but I know New Hampshire. So I'm very productive in the state senate. I've been able to move significant things forward, like the charter school law, which was quite novel when I began campaigning in the Upper Valley, where I live and have lived for 40 years. People didn't understand what charter schools were. I had to explain it. People liked it a lot. Then it took a lot of work to get it passed, get the House and the Senate behind it, and the governor behind it. And now we have 22 charter schools in the state, and I've had the immense privilege of touring them over this past winter. I sort of fell out of touch with them as I went back into the private sector over the past 10 or 12 years. And I've been amazed. They're turning people's lives around. The North Country Charter Academy up in Littleton, I met a gentleman whose name I won't mention, but who told me his story. He graduated a couple of 3 months ago, and he's going off to California to become a software engineer. He was described by this is just 3 years ago, described by his school district as a failure. Could not succeed in school. His life was nothing. That's the message he picked up. He got to this North Country Charter Academy, life turned around. The Academy of Science and Design over in Nashua is our top testing school in the state. It's a STEM school. They are taking special education students. It's all comers, random, and every student coming out of there has calculus, and they are doing what many people say needs to happen in our school system to bring that level of math, science, engineering into our school system. Top testing school in the state, operating 1/3 the cost per student. So we're solving problems. We're improving people's lives. We're solving problems. I initiated the debate to bring electricity competition to our state here. That was a really new idea when I started with that. I had to explain how in heck could you have electricity competition with one wire coming into the building. 95% of all businesses in this state are now availing themselves of customer choice on electricity. And it's saving money, billions of dollars. So I believe that there are a couple of approaches that are suggested to Republicans to deal with gridlock in Washington, which is what we got. We got a country that has problems that are some decades in the making in some cases that are unaddressed. One approach is to just, vote with President Obama. Cave in, we would say, as a Republican. The approach that I would take, because Republicans are not prepared to do that. What I found when I was in the state Senate is by bringing bold ideas to the table, and they're premised on our values, our Republican values of liberty and small government and constitutionally restrained government and balanced budgets. If the ideas are strong enough and make a lot of common sense and solve people's problems and improve people's lives, people will come aboard, and we will break gridlock that way. It's a problem-solving approach that I believe will get us through Washington, not capitulating to Wall Street or whatever it is that the establishment is telling me that Republicans need to do. I'm not in favor of that. You can look at my agenda here for U.S. Senate. I clearly am unusual in the country. I'm the only Republican running for the United States Senate. Matter of fact, for Congress, I'm the only Republican running for Congress who backs public financing of elections. I believe we've got a problem in Washington that stems not just from the differences of philosophy between Republicans and Democrats, but it's a corrupted Congress. It's infested with special interest money to the extent to run for U.S. Senate it costs millions of dollars to run, to win. And to raise that money, your typical U.S. Senator spends half, 2/3 of their time during their entire 6 years in office not doing the people's work, dialing for dollars. Where do you get the dollars? Not from New Hampshire. You can't raise $3, $5, $7 million here in New Hampshire. You can raise $1 million, $1.5 million, max. You've got to go to the interest groups that wind up by giving you money, creating quid pro quos, unwritten, unspoken, and it distorts the political. I'll stop there.
If I could just interject a quick question, because I just wonder what the idea would be to, when you get down to Washington, to overcome Supreme Court precedents on this, on campaign finance.
Well, because I believe, I don't think we're going to overcome the Supreme Court's reluctance to inhibit people's right to say what they want, and the Supreme Court has said money is speech under the First Amendment. So I'm not, we have roughly 3 decades of work trying to put fingers in the dike on the First Amendment, and the money, no matter what law is passed, interest groups will find a way, individuals who have an axe to grind or a noble purpose to achieve, they will find a way around. They'll be endlessly inventive. So I'm proposing an alternative for candidates who don't want to be corrupted by special interest money, which is voluntary public financing, sufficiently funded so that the sums of money are large enough so a candidate can run a fully fledged race where there's sufficient sums to communicate to the people, and it gives an alternative. They have it in Maine, they have it in Connecticut, they have it in Arizona. In Maine, 85% of legislators are publicly financed, and they report back to their Secretary of State in Maine, who's required to survey the legislature to see how this program is working.
That doesn't end the arms war, it just sort of arms.
It provides a completely alternative mechanism by which people can get elected. And again, the experiment is in Maine. That was the first one. In 2000 they did it. And 85% of the people in the Maine legislature have voluntarily decided, instead of going to the well, to the public, to the interest groups, they go to the public system. And they report back to the Secretary of State that they are free to listen to their constituents all the time. Lobbyists come in their door, they listen, but there's no special wait.
Am I correct, the last time around, though, the Senate candidates both opted out of that, I think? Senator Shaheen and...
I believe in Massachusetts, Brown and Warren did.
That was a voluntary thing to forswear. Forgive me for not knowing exactly what they did, but they agreed to mutually disarm on.
Yeah, but I think in New Hampshire they both chose not to take the voluntary. Yeah.
That's their decision. So I'm proposing this and I believe that the corrupt political money system is an impediment to solving problems, apart from and different from ideological differences. It might be a more important impediment, because there are areas where Republicans and Democrats agree, but both parties are corrupted by the same money. I'll give the example of my clearest example I know of is the Dodd-Frank bill. The Federal Reserve Board, about a week and a half ago, and the FDIC issued a report, and you probably saw it, stating that the 11 too-big-to-fail Wall Street banks have a bigger market share. The taxpayer's still on the hook for the next meltdown. The risks are still there. Their financial ratios, they're still excessively leveraged. They're 22-to-1 according to this analysis. And all of these 11 banks have failed their living will tests, which is a way to be liquidated in the event of a financial. And the reason we have Dodd-Frank, which left the too-big-to-fail banks in this state, we have both parties, both of my two main rivals in this election, voted for Dodd-Frank. And they are both backed by very significant sums of Wall Street money. And it changes how Washington operates. And it's both parties, both of the two leading candidates here, according to the pollsters, have taken this money. Both voted for this bill, which has left our country in this perilous state, subject to the next meltdown, taxpayers on the hook, hurting New Hampshire. Because our community banks here, if you talk to them, they will tell you that it's harder to lend money to small business, it's harder to lend money to first-time home buyers, and these banks in our state did not cause the problem.
What would have been then a better alternative to Dodd-Frank at the time to deal with those too-big-to-fail banks?
Roughly what we did coming out of the S&L crisis. We had another bank meltdown, basically 10 years earlier than that, and the government, rather than, bailing them all out, liquidated them all. We had the Resolution Trust Corporation, took the assets, the assets that were immediately sellable, in other words, the operating entities that were sellable were brought back into the marketplace and sold by their operational entities, and those parts of the assets that were not that were underwater, not sellable right away, were held by the RTC for a number of years and then liquidated over time as the values came back up again. That would have been probably a better way to deal with the meltdown, and it would have sent a message to the management, the stockholders, and bondholders who have largely gotten off scot-free. They've been fined a bit, one quarter of their annual earnings, slap on the wrist, and it would have told them, you can't do that again, because you are in mortal peril if you do that to the taxpayers and to the world's financial system again. And it would have sent a message. And coming out of the Great Depression, we had the Glass-Steagall Act, which busted up the big banks and separated them into high-risk operational entities and conventional banking entities. And it avoided a meltdown for decades. We took away the Glass-Steagall Act under President Clinton. Less than 10 years later, a meltdown. So you won't have people in Congress advocating for what worked after the Great Depression because they're bought and paid for. Their hands are tied behind their back. And I'm being maybe more graphic than your stomachs can tolerate, but if you poll Americans, 96% of Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, believe that Washington is corrupted by the money system that we've got. So maybe we're all wrong, all 96% of us, but I don't think so.
We didn't require Rolaids before we came, just to let
You
you know.
did, yeah. So when I go out campaigning, I'll just stop this and let you ask questions so I don't go on. I'm getting used to talking, but try to listen more than I talk. But the two things I hear, number one, people are just fed up to the gills with career politics in Washington. People who go down there, they make great promises. They get down there, they go to work raising money for their reelection. They become consumed with nothing but getting money to get reelected. And they forget about solving the country's problems. That's what people tell me out on the campaign trail, day after day after day. And they see it, and they're tired of it, and they blame that process, that self-interested political careerism, for the problems of the country. And the second thing that people are concerned about is, maybe the first thing, is the state of the economy. People are worried about their jobs. People's real incomes have dropped 6 to 8% since President Obama and Jean Chen took office. This is real. 6 to 8% decline in inflation-adjusted earnings for the typical family in America. Cost of living is up, gas, education, and it's putting families in a squeeze. 1 out of 8 Americans, 1 out of 8 either don't have a job, have given up looking, or are underemployed. 2 out of 3 young people out of college, a lot of debt, can't get a full-time job. So the economy is a very serious concern for folks. And you look at the published unemployment rate, and the economy's getting better, and the DJI is going up. That doesn't reflect what people are feeling out there in the world. So we've got to fix the economy, and we've got to change the corrupt political system in Washington.
And we're familiar with your strong support of gun rights and the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
But I think we can agree here that we all want our country to be a safer place.
Absolutely.
Do you have any practical or common sense plans or approaches that you would bring to the table that specifically addresses the balance of gun owner rights and making the country a safer place?
Yeah, if you go to my website, I actually turned that into an op-ed that was published in the Valley News a while ago. And it is on my website. I think I have 6 points that would actually work to reduce gun violence, because the common objective that everyone could agree to is reduce gun violence. And there are ways you can do it. Just ticking them off, and I'll be really brief because you can go to my website and see them. They're explained a little bit better with hyperlinks to the research data. Number one, the mental health care system we've got in the country is busted. We have people with mental health problems in emergency rooms, beating up on nurses. It's horrible. We have them going to prison. We have prisons being substitute for a proper mental health system. So that's item one. Item two, we know clearly that, and I know your paper worked on this, and 18 to 1, 14 to 1, if you have an armed individual, an armed, trained individual in a place where people congregate, whether it be a school or a movie theater or a shopping mall, that person can reduce the mortality if a crazy goes in there and starts firing at will. It works, and the data is there, and I dispute your PolitiFact, maybe it's not yours, but dispute the findings in it because they stretch the data set in order to reach a predetermined conclusion. If you look at the data set just of circumstances where perpetrators did acts of mass violence in these type of places, schools particularly, movie theaters, etc., you will clearly see the data shows that you will reduce. And why do we have cops on the street? Because it keeps people safer. It's the same principle. Number two, we know that in school shootings, this is a study that was done by the Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education, looking at all instances of gun violence, using roughly the same screen rejected by the PolitiFact Observer. This is not me again. This is the U.S. Department of Education. The Secret Service looked at all instances of school mass shootings over a 20-year period. Found that about 2 out of 3 cases, roughly 2 out of 3 cases, there was a perpetrator whose peers knew of the specifics of the plan days and weeks in advance. So I'm encouraging schools to encourage principals, teachers, to encourage people who know these individuals, like the Columbine circumstance, to report it and intercede. We know that in approximately 2 out of 3 cases, this gets into psychology, that these individuals who are perpetrating these acts have often been subjected to severe instances of bullying. And I'll tie this back to my charter school tour. And I visited about 2/3 of the charter schools in the state, and I had an opportunity to interview the students in the charter schools. And I'd ask them, what's different about, open-ended question, what's different about your school versus the K through 12 school you were in before? And they'd say, and I didn't initiate this conversation, they'd say to me, there's no bullying here. It struck me in every single case, there's no bullying here. These are kids typically who might not have fit into their school. And I'd say, why is there no bullying here? And they'd say, it's not tolerated here. It's not part of our culture here. If we see it beginning, the very early stages of it, we resist it as a community. We help. No one feels the need to do it anymore. So this ties back to gun violence. If you look at these instances of these school shootings, you will find frequently, more than half the case, that there's an individual who is subjected to severe severe life-bending, distorting social pressure that resulted in them lashing out in this way. So again, deal with the underlying problem. Now, those are 3 or 4 of the solutions. I'm proposing that gun shops, as they are doing here involuntarily in New Hampshire, we have guns used for suicides. And so gun stores in this state, most of them have voluntarily implemented a program. If they see someone coming into a gun store looking to buy a gun who doesn't look like they're buying it for recreation or self-defense, but who has an appearance and they're trained to know what this is, they will not sell them a gun. This is happening voluntarily. So there are ways to dramatically reduce gun violence. Gun restrictions don't work. Go to Chicago, strong gun restrictions, and they have the highest rates because what is causing gun violence? Social pressure, drug dealing, gang violence. This is what's causing most of the gun violence. You go to Vermont, where they have concealed carry without requirement that anyone get a permit. It's the most lenient almost in the country. There's very little gun violence. So it's the culture, it's not the guns. And there are 300 million privately owned guns in the U.S. You could ban every gun from henceforth, and a criminal is going to get one quickly. So we've got to do stuff that actually deals with the problem. I know it feels simple to take a gun away from someone. You're not going to wind up taking it away from the perpetrator who wishes to exact illegal violence.
Would you? Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of just a secondary question about guns, but
Yeah.
would you disagree or agree with the notion that the size and influence of the NRA as a lobby is holding sway over the political process?
There's no question, they're a powerful lobby, no question at all. But the individuals in the state of New Hampshire who are defenders of the Second Amendment, who are very numerous, their opinions are not driven by the NRA. This is deeply held values and views of the people who live in the state here. They don't read any playbooks of the NRA to reach the conclusions that they reach when I talk with folks here in the state.
Well, I take note of the fact
Yeah.
that it's been 20 years since any significant legislation on gun control has been passed in Congress, and
Yeah. Well, states are, you can see states have done some stuff.
yeah.
States and localities have done some very aggressive gun control, and it hasn't reduced the violence.
One thing that I wanted to add, your example of Vermont, I know a few months ago when there was special attention on the drug issues in Vermont, there was a lot of reporting done by BPR and other media outlets showing that, while there might not be rates of violent crime in Vermont, that certainly there was a lot of gun sales going on in Vermont because of lax, permits and concealed carry, and that was something that was very concerning. So, while there's your point about decreased gun violence, I mean, there could also be the point that it's that these laws are making it easier for guns to wind up in the hands of criminals in some other state that might be more violent.
Criminals will, again, there are 300 million privately owned guns in the U.S., and criminals will get a gun in the black market. Look at our drug war. Okay, we have an incredible, I think it's $25 billion a year we've been spending on the drug war, and it is a complete failure because the black market has found a way to keep the supply going, despite the immense amount of effort spent by the federal government to suppress supply. It hasn't worked. So again, the mutual objective is reduce gun violence, and there are things that we can do that really work, that really work.
Jim, we mentioned mental health care.
Yeah.
Kind of throw that out as a topic, as a solution, but what specifically about mental health care are you proposing?
Well, we have a system, we have too few, emergency beds. The state of New Hampshire settled a lawsuit, as you folks know, building a few more beds. It'll probably be an insufficient number, is my guess, judging from people that I talk with, because I've been campaigning for 14 months, and I've met emergency room nurses, I've met people who work in prisons, and they give me a sense of the size of the problem, and so I think we need more capacity in the mental health system.
Is this a federal solution?
It's a state issue. There's a role in the insurance industry. There's a role in the medical system itself. There's a need to stop this sense that a heart attack is something that happens to people and it's not your own fault, and there's a stigma against, for example, major depression, as it was once called, which is organic. We now know. That's just as valid a reason to seek out and get health care. Major depression, heart disease, those are equally valid reasons to seek out, and there's the stigma against mental health, and people avoid seeking it out, they conceal it. People shouldn't do that anymore.
So when you get to Washington as a senator, what kind of proposals would you be making at the U.S. Senate level on this?
For mental health care.
Yeah.
Yeah. As we refashion the healthcare system, which I believe Obamacare is an awful failure, we need to refashion a healthcare system that has capacity for mental health. I don't believe we ought to be using prisons as mental health systems, which we are now.
So is that something that the federal government needs to implement some standards on the states in order to make strides in this direction?
Yeah, as we refashion, as people seek out insurance, I think that insurance ought to have fulsome options for mental health services. There ought not to be, to the extent there are not limits on care for cancer, there should not be limits on mental health services. And people ought to seek out insurance voluntarily on that basis that provide those services.
But the
To the
notion
extent we're
states are
spending-
institutionalizing people rather than.
To the
feeling-
extent, well, we have prison capacity in this
Yeah,
country,
yeah.
and we ought to take some of that capacity and the money going into it, some of it is federal money, some is state money, and divert those funds flows into assistance for people who would be better served in a mental health system of some kind. So we don't need to spend more money, we need to stop using prisons as failed mental health service systems, and when judges sentence people, this ought to be taken into account. So some of this, a lot of this could be state law. The healthcare system in the U.S. is obviously really complicated, and making it work better, we spend twice as much per capita as our industrial nation competitors on health care in the U.S. It's a huge burden on our economy. We have, again, we're roughly twice the spending per capita, and the measured outcomes of our health system and health status is about average in the industrial world. So we're spending a premium, a super premium price, and getting about average results. And so if you're in the manufacturing industry, you'd say, well, we've got to reform the system and find the savings in that waste and improve our quality from those savings, would be how Edward Deming would attack the problem. And that's what we have to do in the United States. We can't continue having the world's most expensive health care system that gives only average results. We're going to be spending, if we, on business as usual, we'll be spending about $1 trillion a year on obesity and diabetes-related disease within by the year 2020 or 2022, and that is too much. So we've got to be managing. It's not a mental health problem, but we've got to manage this very large social cost problem in just a better way with a better health delivery system. So that's why I favor things like community health clinics. We have 10 of them in the state. They deliver primary care and this is again on my website. Go to my repeal and replace Obamacare link under issues. See, we have people not obtaining health services. So how do we do that? Obamacare is one approach, which is not working. It'll leave 20 to 30 million people uninsured. So this community health clinic approach is a better way. They're governed by community boards, 51% controlled by patients. Again, there are 10 of them in New Hampshire. They're measurably delivering primary health services, including to people with no insurance at half the cost of the hospital profit-making insurance model that we use right now. The model works. It's an alternative approach. It's organic. It's bottom-up. It's local.
While you're there, you also talk on your site about means testing for Social Security and
Yes.
Medicare.
Yeah. Yep.
Quite a few other options for repealing or for replacing Obamacare as a health.
Yeah.
Do you want to go into those a little bit quickly?
Yeah, I'll start with talking about the budget problem. One of the biggest problems confronting the U.S. is our balance sheet. Our nation's credit card is maxed out now. We're pushing $18 trillion in debt. When you add the unfunded future promises for unfunded pensions, unfunded Social Security, unfunded Medicare, unfunded CHIP, now Obamacare, you're pushing way up over $100 trillion of debt and unfunded future promises. So we've got to deal with that problem. We've avoided having to confront that because this year Congress is spending $1 out of every $5 being spent to run our federal government is printed money. The Chinese have roughly stopped loaning us money now, so we're just printing the money and the problem with this, if we were printing the money to fight World War II or to dramatically improve the nation's infrastructure, there's payoff downstream. When you build a bridge, you've got a 30, 40, 50-year asset. So you're borrowing money right now, you're paying interest on it, but you're getting something. You're driving trucks and cars over that. We're borrowing money now to pay current expenditures. We're borrowing money to buy groceries. And we're loading this debt onto our kids and grandkids. And if we face a natural disaster, or a serious war, with our nation's credit card maxed out, we're in trouble. So this ties back to Medicare and Social Security, which is a big part of the unfunded future promises. We've got to deal with it. We've known about this for 3 decades, 10,000 baby boomers are retiring per day. We've got to deal with it. We've got to have some leadership in Congress to deal with this problem. It's incredibly difficult. What I'm trying to do is put something on the table of substance that shows I'm willing to touch the third rail. We have to deal with it. We can't delay this anymore. And if you look at the other candidates, they have no proposals whatsoever. And their approach will likely be, as it has been for the past 20 or 30 years in Congress, to kick the can down the road for another 2 years, another 6 years. And with debt to GDP at over 105%, pushing 110%, we've hit the red line now. We can't delay it anymore. So this is where leadership comes in. This is where statesmanship comes in. We've got to deal with these problems. So I'm putting something substantial on the table. I myself oppose taking Social Security away from people who work with their bodies, whose bodies continue to wear out at age 65 or earlier. Some people propose, adjusting the inflation adjustment. I'm proposing means testing for millionaires. Warren Buffett does not need Social Security.